Define link dimension and its advantages and disadvantages is an important SSAS interview question. Let's see what is link dimension first. Link dimension is a dimension based on a different dimension which is developed and deployed onto the database of a different analysis service instance. For example, let's say you have multiple instances. This is one instance of analysis services. In this, you deployed a database. Okay. Let's say this database name is AdventureWorks DW, and you have one cube in it, and this guy has 10 dimensions defined. Let's say dimension 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, here you are defining another database. You are creating another cube, and this is in a different instance, and this is your cube. In that, you can give a reference, or you can create a dimension based on the dimensions that are available on another instance. So what you will be having is just a reference to the dimension in server A in server B. The reference of server A dimension will be available in B, and we call these kind of dimensions as link dimensions. It has a couple of advantages, and also it has a lot of disadvantages. First, let's discuss how to create a link dimension. Let me erase the drawing center. Yeah, I have taken two analysis service projects just to demonstrate an example of creating link dimensions. First, the one I created with the name provider cube, in which I have one data source created, data source view created, and I've created a cube with fact internet sales as the fact table, and I have only one dimension, that is dim date. And the second cube name is consumer cube, because it is going to consume the dimension that is defined on the provider. These are the naming conventions I have given. I know it's pretty bad, pretty poor naming conventions, but this is just for an example sake. So in this consumer cube, what I've done is I created a dimension dim product, and the fact table is again the fact internet sales, and the cube is ready. And this is my SQL Server Management Studio connected to the local analysis services. And there is, the consumer cube and the provider cube are not yet deployed. Okay, so I have two cubes ready. Now my requirement is to create a link dimension for this dim date in my consumer cube. That means I'm not going to create a physical dimension in my consumer cube, but I'm going to create a link dimension based on the cube, based on the dimension that is available in the provider cube. Let me keep these two side by side so that it will be easy for understanding. Let me minimize this guy. Okay. Okay, here it is. So these are the two different cubes that I have. I'm yet to deploy these two cubes. So there are a couple of points that you have to keep in mind while creating a link dimension. The first and foremost thing is the source server from where you are gonna take the cube, take the dimension and create a link dimension in the target server. These two servers should have the same version, or it should be compatible versions. Okay, that's the first point you have to keep in mind. And the second thing is the source from where you are gonna take the reference of the cube, reference of the dimension, should be processed. It should be in process state. Currently, this is not processed. The source cube, if you see, I have not processed it, and hence I don't have it in my analysis services. There is no database called source or provider cube, right? So I'm yet to process my provider cube. That's why it's not a process. But you have to keep in mind the provider which is providing the reference of the dimension should be processed. And the third point is you have to enable a couple of properties, couple of analysis services server level properties, which I'm going to show you very shortly. And the fourth one is the dimension that you're going to use from the source should not be a link dimension. If you see here, this is not a link dimension. This dim date is a physical dimension. You can take the help of a physical dimension to create a link dimension. So you have to keep these 4 points in your mind. The first thing, let's see the compatibility. Fortunately, in my case, I have only one instance, and one instance in my local computer, and you can see the version of the computer here, version of the analysis service here. When you connect to the analysis services, it will show you that it's Microsoft Analysis Services 12.0.2000.8. So this should be compatible with, among the two servers that you're going to use to create the link dimension. The source server and the destination server should be having compatible versions. That's the first point. And let's see the second point. The provider here should be in process state. If you see the provider cube, this is not yet processed, this is not yet deployed into my server. So first what I have to do is I have to make sure that this is deployed and processed. So let me do that quickly. I'm going to deploy it into my localhost analysis server. Okay, let me click on run. Okay, the source or provider is processed, and let's have a quick look in SSMS2 whether it reflects or not. Here it is, the provider cube, it is processed successfully. Now let's go to the third point. The third point, what I said is like you have to enable a couple of properties here that relates to the link dimension creation, linked object creation. The properties, you can see those properties, and if you go to SSMS and connect to analysis services and right click on the local host or the server name, and when you go to the properties, I'm using 2014 here, and under general you can see three properties related to this link dimensions. The first one is linked from other instance enable, and the second one is linked inside instance enable, and third one is linked to other instance enable. So linked to other instance enable means the current instance will act as source, and link from other instance enable means you are going to request a dimension from the second instance or some any other instance apart from the instance for which you are enabling this property. So you can easily understand you need to enable these properties. I already set it to true. You can see the current value is enabled, and you can set I set it to true. You have to set it to true to make a link dimension work. So let me click on OK. And the fourth point is the source dimension or the dimension from which you are going to take the reference should not be a link dimension by itself. So this is the dimension I'm gonna use in my destination or the consumer cube. So this dim date is not a link dimension, this is a physical dimension, and so I can use this dimension to create a link dimension in my consumer cube. Now let me go to the consumer cube solution. This is my consumer cube solution, and it is not yet processed, and it has dim product and the cube defined. Now my next step is to create a link dimension. How to create a link dimension? Let's quickly have a look at it. So for that you need to right click on the dimensions, and you can see the option new linked dimension. Click on the new link dimension, click on next, and here you need to create a data source. Let me create the data source here pointing to the analysis services from where you are going to use the link dimension. So I'm going to new, and I'm going to give the server name from where I'm going to pull the dimension reference, and let me select the database name. So provider cube, this is why I said you need to process the source or the provider cube, because it won't be shown, it will not be shown here if you have not processed it. So let me test the connection. The connection is established. Click on OK. Next, click on service account for now, or you can give any specific account impersonation mode. Click on next, and this is the data source created. Okay. Now once the data source is created, provider cube is the name of the data source, and you can see the provider cube data source is created here. When you click on next, it will show all the dimensions that are available in the particular source or the provider cube. So I have only one dimension defined, and I'm going to consume the dimension in my consumer cube in this case. So this is the dimension. Let me click on next by selecting it and click on finish. So if you see here, a dimension is created which looks like a normal dimension, but actually it's a linked dimension. What's the difference between linked and how can you find out whether it's a linked or the physical dimension? If you open a physical dimension, this is how it looks. You can see everything, attribute and all. When you open a linked dimension, this is how you can see. You can't see any stuff here. You can't do anything. This is just a reference to the dimension that is actually or physically available on the other database in the same instance or in any other instance, any other server. Okay. And what you can do hardly is you can change the dimension name and you can create translations. That option is available. You can create the translations for these guys, and browser option will be available, but you have to process it. Now, this is how you can create a link dimension. Now, let me quickly process the cube and see the data in the link dimension. So if I click on process, you will encounter an issue. This is one issue related to the property. Let me show you that quickly once the process. Yep, the process is triggered now. Okay, cool. No issues, and everything went fine. Let me reconnect it here, and you can see the data of the date dimension, which is available in a different cube, and for which I have created a linked cube linked dimension in this particular cube, and you can see the data, and it acts just like another dimension. Okay, so the dimension is processed successfully, but the only problem is it is read only. You can't edit it, you can't make any changes to the attribute structure, or you can't make any changes to the attribute relationships and so on. Okay, now let me try to add this one to my cube. I'm adding the link dimension, that is dim date, to my cube, and the relationships are not set here, so you have to provide the relationships manually. That's one extra work you have to do when you are using link dimension. So I'm setting the relationship for the dim date to due date of the fact internet sales table. Click on OK. Now, if I process it, let me quickly do that. When I try to process it, it's throwing up an error while deploying the cube. Let's see the error, what it is reporting here. The fact internet sales measure group cannot be created because it uses a dim date link dimension. So this is the dim date link dimension which we are using, whose unknown member property is set to none. So you have to remember that the unknown member property of the dimension which you are using as a link dimension should be set either to visible or hidden. But the default value for the dimension property is none. So what you need to do to avoid this kind of error is you have to go to the dimension in the source or the provider cube and go to the properties by selecting the that dimension and go to the by pressing F4. It will take you to the properties, and you can see here the unknown member property is set to none. This should be either visible or hidden. I don't want to show it, so I'll keep it hidden. So once it is done, what I need to do is I need to process the cube once again to reflect these changes in my provider database. Okay, the unknown member property is changed to hidden, and I process the source database, and let me go to the consumer cube which we have created and which you are consuming the dimension from the source or provider cube. Let me quickly process it now. So if you see here, again you are getting one more error. This is most commonly encountered error when you are using link dimensions. That is, the metadata for the statically linked dimension with the name of dim date cannot be verified against the source object. What does it mean? So this means that the metadata of the dimension in the source is changed, and hence what we have to do here is we have to remove the dimension again and we have to create the link dimension again. This is the major drawback of using link dimensions. If you make any changes to the structure of your source dimension, then you have to delete the dimension, which will obviously delete the relationships and everything in the cube, and you have to add the link dimension again and the relationships, blah blah blah, everything again. So this is the major drawback of using link dimensions. So the changes are pretty common in the dimension level, so the metadata changes, so that comes every week or every month. So whenever the change happened in your source, then you have to remove the link dimension in all the targets, and you have to rebuild everything. So that is time taking one and also not suggestible one, right? So let me add the dimension again to the cube, and let me give the relationships. So this is really painful thing. I'm gonna give relationship to the due date. Now let me quickly process the whole database. So I'm trying to show you what all errors you will encounter while creating the link dimensions and how to overcome those errors. Now you can see it's processing. Okay, the process succeeded, and once it is completed, then it's pretty easy to use. It's just like any other physical dimension. Let me quickly try to browse this particular dimension. I'm taking calendar year from here, and I'm taking sales amount. And you can see it's just like accessing in plain physical dimension. So this is about creating the link dimension and what are the steps you have to take care of and what kind of errors you may encounter and how to overcome those errors. So the first and foremost point you have to keep in mind is the versioning compatibility. The source version, the source server and the target server should have compatibility. And the second point is you have to enable a couple of properties on the target server. And the third point is the source dimension on the source cube should be processed. And the fourth point is the source dimension which you are using to create a link dimension should not be a link dimension by itself. And the fifth point here is the source dimension unknown property should be set to either hidden or visible. And the sixth point to remember is if you make any metadata changes to your source dimension, then you have to remove or delete the link dimension in all the targets where all you are using that particular dimension which has metadata changes as source, and you have to redo all the work, including adding the dimension and adding the dimension to the cube and adding the relationships between the measure groups and the cubes. So now this is all about creating the link dimension. Let's quickly go through the pros and cons of this link dimension. First, let's discuss about the disadvantages. The first disadvantage is if anything happens to the source, let's say the source become unavailable or any problem with the source, and the same dimension from that particular source is used, let's say the dim date dimension is used in 10 different target databases, then everything will go for a toss. Nothing will be available. For example, let me show you that quickly. Here, if I refresh, I should see those two cubes, provider and source, and this is the provider, which is provider and consumer. This provider is the one which is acting as source. And let me do something here. Let me unprocess it. I'm unprocessing it, or some changes that I have made here. Now, what are all the databases that are using this particular dimension as source to create link dimension in the particular in the databases, everything will go offline. For example, this is one of the database which is using dim date from provider cube to create a link dimension. This is the link dimension which we have created, and if you try to connect and query this particular cube, it will say nothing available because the source is unprocessed. You can see here the version of the linked dimension with the name dim date on the remote instance has changed. Repeat the operation to resolve the issue. So that's the problem. Now I have to process this, and that means the source, the database which is acting as source should be always online. There should not, if that one goes offline, then all the targets will go offline. This is one of the major disadvantage. And the second disadvantage is if any metadata changes, as we discussed and as I've shown you guys, you have to delete everything and you have to redo this work. That is really painful. And the third disadvantage is the link dimension is a read-only one. You can't make any changes to the attributes and you can't make any changes to the relationships. That's the problem. That's the biggest problem. So if your dimension structure and the dimension attribute names remain the same in every target machine, then only you can use the option called link dimensions. And the third disadvantage is you can't go with any other structure apart from the structure defined in your source cube. For example, if you have 10 attributes, you have to go with those 10 attributes in every target. You can't restrict to 2 attributes or 3 attributes. You can't add an extra attribute. In short, it's just a read-only dimension. It's just a reference created on the physical dimension on the source database. So these are the disadvantages, and let's quickly have a look at the advantages of it. The advantages, one of the advantage, the first advantage is you don't need to have this one physically in every database. That means it's gonna save some space for you. Let's say you have a dimension which is, I have seen a couple of dimensions, the whole dimension size somewhere around 10 gigs. And the same dimension is used in multiple databases across the plan. So in those cases, you can use that particular dimension in all the targets using the link dimension because it's gonna save a lot of space for you guys. For example, let me show you where the space will be saved. I'm going to the location where the cube will be deployed, that is program files. And this is the default Microsoft location. I have not changed it for the data folder. And the data, you can see this is the consumer cube and this is the provider cube. If I go to the provider cube, this is the date dimension, the physical dimension which I have created. And if I go to the properties of it, you can see the size of this dimension. This is pretty small dimension, 329 bytes and just 4 KB. Now let me go to the consumer cube. And this is the link dimension I have created based on the physical dimension on the provider cube. If I go to the properties, it's just 0 bytes. You don't need to have, it's just a reference to the physical data, physical dimension that is available in different cubes. So this is how you can save. Let's say you have a source database in which a dimension size is 5 gigabytes. And you have 10 targets which is using the same dimension. So if you use a link dimension, then you are going to save 5 into 10, that is 50 gigabytes of space. That is one advantage. And the second advantage is the processing time. You need to process the whole dimension only in the source database from where you are giving reference to all the targets. So that is going to save some time for processing on all the 10 different databases. I have seen a client with the similar dimension structure. Let's say he has 100 dimensions, all similar dimensions across 7 different cubes, and each cube dimension processing was taking something around 2 hours. You can imagine how big was the dimensions. If the particular user uses the link dimension option, then he will save a lot of time and in processing and a lot of space. So if you ask me about which is good to, whether to go with the link dimension or not, then for sure I'll suggest not to go with the link dimension because the disadvantages are too high compared to the advantages that it is going to bring to us. So this is the complete story about link dimension. Hope you understood the concepts, and please try playing with this link dimension. This is really good concept and very important interview question too. Stay tuned for more videos on SSIS, SSAS, and SSRS interview questions. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.